As a PC technician, you're going to be spending a great deal of time working with memory in computer systems. There's a wide variety of different types of memory that have been implemented over the years. Because you're going to be working a lot with memory, installing, upgrading, etc., you need to be very familiar with the different types of memory and what type of memory needs to go where. The first memory package we want to look at is the 72-pin SIMM, S-I-M-M. That stands for Single Inline Memory Module. Actually, the very first versions of SIMMs were 30 pins. You'll probably not ever see a 30-pin SIMM anymore. If you see SIMMs at all, they'll be the 72-pin variety. Now, SIMMs came in 3 different flavors. The earliest version were Fast Page Mode RAM, or FPM RAM. Then we had Extended Data Out, or EDO RAM. And we had Burst Extended Data Out RAM, or BEDO RAM. Now, notice over here there's a little notch. It's not on this side. This notch was included to keep you from inserting the SIMM in the memory slot backwards. In essence, it functions kind of like a key. When you installed SIMMs in a system, sometimes you had to install them in pairs instead of singly. The basic rule for banking is to divide the width of the data bus of the PC system by the width of the memory module, and that tells you how many memory modules must be installed at a given time. For example, all 72-pin SIMM memory modules are 32 bits wide. If you installed one of these 72-pin SIMM modules in a PC system that used a 64-bit data bus, how many of these would you have to install using that banking rule? Well, you divide 64 by 32, that gives you 2. That means you would have to install SIMMs in pairs. In fact, back in the old days when we dealt with SIMMs, you pretty much always had to install them in pairs, unless you were dealing with an older PC system, such as a 286 or a 386 whose bus was only 32 bits wide, then you could install them singly. But that didn't happen very often. Most of the time, those systems used older 30-pin SIMMs, and they were only half as wide. They were only 16 bits wide, so we still had to use that banking rule. That banking rule will save your life. Just remember, width of the data bus divided by the width of the memory module tells you how many memory modules you have to install at a time. The next type of memory we want to look at is the 168-pin SDRAM DIMM. DIMM stands for Dual Inline Memory Module. You'll notice that there are 2 sets of pins. Now, if you looked at the bottom of a DIMM, you'd say, well, it's got a set of pins on the bottom too. Well, each row of pins on each side performs a different set of functions, unlike with a SIMM. Now, a DIMM is 64 bits wide, or 8 bytes wide. Therefore, how many of these DIMMs, 168-pin DIMMs, do you suppose you would need to install if your data bus on your motherboard is 64 bits wide? If this DIMM is 64 bits wide and the data bus on your motherboard is 64 bits wide, you install them one at a time. That means you can have 1, 2, 3, or 4 DIMMs in a PC system that fits that particular criteria. Now notice that there are 2 notches in here to prevent you from inserting this DIMM into its slot backwards. Now, early versions of these DIMMs ran at 5 volts. There weren't very many because motherboards switched about the time the DIMM came out from 5 volts, which is what SIMMs ran at, to 3.3 volts. Most of the DIMMs you're going to run into are 3.3 volts. These notches are used to prevent you from inserting a 5-volt DIMM into a 3.3-volt DIMM slot and vice versa. Now, there was a second version of DIMM that was used frequently, and that's the SO-DIMM. Now, SO-DIMMs are used in notebook systems. There's 2 different sizes. One size used 144 pins. The other size used 200 pins. Now, the banking rule that we talked about with SIMMs and DIMMs still applies to SO-DIMMs. As a DIMM, it is 64 bits wide. So if it's installed in a system whose motherboard's data bus is 64 bits wide, therefore you only need to install these one at a time. Now, the next type of memory that you might come in contact with, although probably not, is the Rambus RIM. Now, Rambus is very fast. It's a very good piece of memory. It's also very expensive. This, by the way, is not a real RIM. This is what's called a continuity RIM. I'll explain to you what that is in just a second. Now, RIM, people always say, well, what's RIM stand for? SIM stands for Single Inline Memory Module. DIM stands for Dual Inline Memory Module. What does RIM stand for? Well, as far as I've been able to tell, nothing really. I mean, you could say maybe it stands for Rambus Inline Memory Module, but you never see that. All the docs refer to it as simply a RIM. They never spell out what the acronym actually means. Now, RIMs work very differently than SIMs or DIMs. One of the key differences is the fact that every memory slot on the motherboard, when you're dealing with RIMs, has to be populated. That means that if you just install a single RIM, because a RIM, by the way, is 64 bits wide, so if you were installing it in a motherboard that used a 64-bit data bus, you could install RIMs singly. If you did so, say you installed a 512 megabyte RIM in one memory slot of your motherboard and you had 3 empty slots, well, those 3 other slots have to be populated. To do that, we use this device right here, which is called a continuity RIM. Basically, this is a space taker-upper. You put this in the empty memory slots on your Rambus system, and it provides just what the name says. It provides continuity so the memory will work. Now, because RIMs ran so much faster than SIMs or DIMs, they also generated a tremendous amount of heat. Most RIMs use a heat dissipation device called a heat spreader that's used to draw the heat off of the RIMs and off the continuity RIMs and let the air that's being pumped into the system through the power supply cool the memory down. Now, just as there was a laptop version of DIMs, there's also a laptop version of RIMs, and that's called the SO-RIM. Basically just Rambus RAM for a laptop or notebook system, which used 160 pins, and we called it an SO-RIM. The last type of RAM I want to talk about is DDR SDRAM. Now, DDR RAM, the early version, had 184 pins. There has since been a newer version released called DDR2, which used 240 pins. No matter which type of memory you're dealing with, whether you're dealing with DDR RAM, whether you're dealing with DIMs or RIMs, SO-RIMs, SO-DIMs, or SIMs, the banking rule that we talked about earlier still applies. You have to divide the width of the data bus by the width of the memory module. That tells you how many modules you have to install at a time. For the most part, with DDR RAM, you can install them one at a time because the width of the module is the same width as the data bus. In this lesson, we looked at the various different types of RAM that have been implemented in PC systems, and we also talked about the rules for banking